First, we're going to bring you up to date where we are, and then get into the analysis of areas most suitable for development, kind of continuing the conversation we had on that last time. And then a recap of the alternate development scenarios and then what some of those scenarios might do. And so we're going to show you some new graphics related to that. And then introduce the draft growth principles that was sent out by Robin Monday. So we'll talk through some of that. We're going to ask for feedback between now and next Friday, the 7th of July. And maybe we can extend that a few extra days to try to lock that down a little bit more. And then show you a little bit about the land use plan report. We're starting to work on formatting of that and testing whether or not it's going to be 8.5 by 11 versus 11 by 17 and so on. And then we'll talk about the homework. Next slide. So right now we are in phase 4, the analysis of future development. We talked about these maps last time and the scenarios. We're beginning to test a lot of that, and we're working with our fiscal analysis consultant, and he is beginning to do the interviews and build a model that will run the numbers for those scenarios. And then in phase 5, working on that report itself and starting to format that. Next slide. So this is a map that you saw last time around. We began a discussion about this. So this map does show a lot of your existing assets, different infrastructure, community facilities, and so on, and where some of those development areas that you're seeing more of the white color coming through in the green, those may be the areas that are more appropriate for development, and we have a map later on that will show that, and how to marry those facilities with what we heard from the community. Concentrate that development within existing communities. So again, that map looked at existing zoning, the communities themselves, infrastructure capacity, so like sewer lines, roadways, and so on. Those facilities such as fire department facilities and so on. The environmental constraints, and what we're talking about there also is related to the next one, which is community conservation. Some of the soils that are best for growing maybe should remain that way. Next slide. And then we have this map as well, and we're going to begin to tighten this up over the next month and test that with the different development scenarios. Some of those areas, including your existing communities, the 4 ways, and so on, where that development might occur. And there was some feedback that we've received since the last meeting that we'll touch on as well related to this map. Next slide. But first of all, we did get a major market analysis update just Monday, and we tried to assemble a summary of what we heard in that analysis. There are some additional things that we're requesting related to that, but we do have some information now to reveal on agriculture, industrial, as well as the but-for, which is the multiplier effect caused by blue oval. Next slide. So for the agriculture, there's over 200,000 acres of land zoned for agriculture. And the Covington zip code 38019 contains the largest portion of that at 71,000 acres, about a third of that. Now, that's not concentrating actually in Covington, but because that zip code is very large, and we have a map that will show that there is a lot of community, but also a lot of countryside and farmland in that zip code. Your primary crops are cotton, grain, and soybeans. That's probably not a surprise to anyone. And then raising livestock is not a major component in comparison to the crops. Now, per acre sales prices have risen substantially, and that has been accelerated by the blue oval effect. And so your farmland and countryside is a bit under threat. Next slide. This will be made available in the presentation on the website. These are the zip code areas and the acreages of agriculture within those. So at the top, you can see again that 38019 is very large, almost 71,000 acres of land that is currently farmland. And then some of the other zip codes as well. Next slide. Getting into the residential growth, this is some new information that we've heard since the last discussion with Howard and our consultant about this. About 1/3 of all new units will have 3 bedrooms. About 20% will be either studio or 1-bedroom units, so that's a small percentage. that will be smaller units. 60% will be of the owner occupied units will be 3 bedrooms or larger. So when you have someone that wants to purchase a house, they are actually looking at something more sizable. Even if they don't need the number of bedrooms, maybe they use it for a study or a guest room instead. And then the blue oval effect, the multiplier caused by blue oval coming will also increase the residential units, the commercial growth that will occur in your community. Next slide. All right, this table, you've seen this table in the past on the left-hand side. You have not seen what is on the right highlighted by yellow. The 5-year, the 10-year, both, and the 20-year, both conservative is the top number in each one of these, moderate, and then aggressive numbers. And at the very bottom, you can see that 5404, which was what we initially thought might be the top unit. That's not residents, that's the number of residential units. That would multiply by your household population. So somewhere between 2 and 3 residents per home. So you're looking at something closer to 15,000 there. But then you add in that but for, and you look on the far right side there, you're looking at the potential for an additional 2,000 residential units caused by businesses and growth that will occur because Blue Oval has come to your area. So that is now raising your total population up to the potential of 7,362 units. So that's getting closer to 20,000 new residents. Next slide. Now for commercial growth, what you've seen again on the left, you've seen before, there's the but for on the right, and then the total new. So
Explain to me again what the but for is right there.
Jonathan just asked about the but for. So but for is your multiplier. Blue Oval is coming, there will be new businesses that will come because Blue Oval is coming. So not the Blue Oval effect itself and its growth, but the but for the businesses that might follow. Oh, they see this now as an area that is growing, that there's new investment going on. So they may choose to move their businesses, expand their restaurants and retail in your area, and then the residents will follow as well. So initially we talked about almost 2 million square feet of retail growth over 20 years. There that is at the bottom. You have the but for multiplier now coming into effect with that new space. So about another 1.7 million square feet, taking you up to 3.7 million square feet total over 20 years. That's quite substantial. That's more than 3 Wolfchase Gallerias in size and comparison. Maybe a few more of those grocery stores, a lot more retail and supportive. And then we'll go into the next slide and talk about some of that retail growth itself. So Howard has given us this table, and this came from his study and also from the survey that you did. And some of those major categories. So here you see the top 10 categories and the miscellaneous and totals at the bottom. What was discovered by that study was that there is a big emphasis on food. And that might be the grocery store effect, which is more or less the top one, but also the restaurant effect in the next one. So the eat and drink. So that is approaching or exceeding 850,000 square feet of just restaurant or food related space. And then some of the other ones, general merchandise, furniture, transportation, drugstore, apparel, hardware, vehicle related, and in the miscellaneous at the bottom, which is also fairly large. It's just kind of fill in the blank for anything that may not be listed above. So totaling that 3.7 million square feet. Now getting into the industrial growth. First of all, we'll talk about where you are existing. The industrial activity totals are at the bottom there, and you see the 3 largest zip codes. And those are, mostly concentrated along your Highway 51 corridor. There's that 38019 zip code again for Covington. It contains the most at 2.3 or 3.5 almost million square feet. And then the total at the bottom of over 2.4 million square feet.
But the most important number here, guys, is starting to talk about that potential for additional. You guys kind of already know where your industrial is. So it's about the potential new industrial that could be captured by Tipton County, which is not to say that all of the 6 million should or would or should be captured by Tipton, but there's the potential for that outside of Haywood. And so that's kind of, I don't want to say it's all up for grabs, but some of that 6 million is up for grabs.
Yes, so that's 6 million square feet of additional industrial space beyond Haywood County would occur because of the blue oval effect, more or less, and the growth trends that we're seeing today. And that is assuming that the infrastructure in the area could accommodate it. And it could be that maybe Tiffin County receives 1 million or 1.5 million square feet of that. Shelby and Fayette and also the Jackson Madison County area may receive some of that as well. Next slide. So we talked about this last time a little bit, where that community, that growth should occur, both within the community and countryside, within your existing municipal boundaries and adjacent to those, and then down in the countryside. Focus on 4 ways like Charleston and some of the others. And then conservation clusters, which would be where a certain percentage of land might be developed. Let's say 25% of the land might become residential, clustering that development so that the areas around it or natural farmland can be preserved. And in the typical pattern, which is your FAR and R1 zoning, and we have a map that will show that as well. Next slide. And in the 5 scenarios, your as of right build out, that is the potential. It's not what is actually occurring in your community. It's scenario 2. That's the typical business as usual pattern. The balanced growth pattern was something that was raised at our different groups. So that's something we're studying. And in scenario 4, which is community focused and clustered in the countryside, and in the community concentration and countryside conservation. Next slide. So what we heard since the last meeting, we did hear a lot of agreement that scenarios 4 and 5 were the ones that were preferred by both the community and steering committee. So community focused and some in the cluster in the countryside, and also the community concentrated scenarios. There were suggestions where additional development might occur and where some of those pressures might be, and that could be related to how the traffic patterns might occur. Specifically, the drive down towards Mason and then the Austin P Highway intersection there was one of the points that was raised there. So we do recognize that there is some pressure in that area, but there's only so much growth that can go around it, and it'll be up to you to choose where that growth occurs. And then there was questions raised both in the last meeting and since then about why analyze the as of right build out. And we have a slide for that next. Okay. So why analyze the as of right build out? First of all, we want to understand the development potential and its fiscal impact to the community. That's more about studying what could potentially occur and happen and what its cost might be on you and the existing residents in the community.
Basically, guys, we got to start with a baseline somewhere, which everything else can be compared, and that's everything else is market. You know, there's some market in this as of right build out analysis, but everything else is purely driven by the market analysis and these numbers that we just went through. And so we've got to show something to which all of that can be compared. Just so think of it as the one analysis with the fewest number of variables. It's kind of the benchmark to which we can compare everything else.
That's right. And we can measure the others to that. So the business as usual pattern, that is measured because we are trying to understand what that current rural development pattern is. We talked about this a little bit last meeting.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt that. So business as usual is applying, that's where we now apply the market analysis to the as of right. So we are starting to add variables. So the as of right is the benchmark. The business as usual is applying the market analysis to the as of right, more or less.
Right. So there's your 2 major rural zoning districts, the forest agricultural residential, which does allow 1 home per acre, but actually over the last 5 years is developing it more like 1 home per 12.64 acres. Some of that could be because of farmlets. It also could be because of the lack of sewer infrastructure. They have to have their own septic systems and so on. And
land values simply allow for homes being built at these values. It allows the land values have been such to where it's affordable for somebody to go in and buy 12.5 acres in which to build a home.
And the same with R1 zoning, it's not actually building at 1 home per the 2/3 of an acre. Over the last 5 years, it's been closer to 1 home per 6 acres. Next slide. And there's your zoning map that shows the areas in green is the forest, agriculture, residential, zoning district, so that's closer to the 1 for 12 acres. And then the yellow, which is developing it more like 1 for 6 acres currently. Slide. This is the development scenario table we talked about last time. In particular, we want to talk a little bit more about what's occurring in the left column, where development is occurring within existing municipal boundaries, and measuring that with our market analysis to determine some of the numbers that might occur population-wise and so on. Well, not population-wise, but unit-wise within your community. So the typical business as usual pattern is somewhere around 25% occurring within those existing municipal boundaries. And then there's another 25% just adjacent to that. But about 50% right now is occurring out in those rural areas. And we'll show you some footprints of what that currently is today as well here shortly. Then there's your balanced growth pattern. So there you've got 35% within municipal boundaries and an additional 15% just adjacent to that. So now you're getting closer to the 50 percentile between the community and the countryside. And then the next one focuses more on the community itself and clustered in the countryside. So there you see now we've raised it to 50% within those existing communities, 10% directly adjacent to it. And then the conservation cluster is your stronger one out in the countryside where you're concentrating development and also preserving some of the land around that for farmland and natural areas.
So one of the benefits here, guys, that we're, as you can tell, without throwing a whole bunch of numbers at you again, as we go through those scenarios, you can see that we're focusing more based on what we heard from you, where we know our existing investments are as far as utilities and assets and amenities are located largely within our existing communities, that we're dialing up investment within those existing communities and near them, which is a very, by the way, fiscally responsible way. I don't need the analysis to tell me that the shorter the sewer line is, and I've got to extend, the more affordable it is, the more fiscally responsible it is. So we're focusing that development of the community, and we're seeking to ensure that more of our working farmland, because we've heard how important that is, remains in place tomorrow. So that's as we go down that scale, as we go down that list of scenarios, the more we're focusing within our existing footprints for our municipalities, and the tighter we are on the footprint when we do have development out in the countryside, the smaller that footprint is. It's not saying it's fewer homes out there always. We're not always saying that we're not depriving landowners or farmers who are looking to get out of the farming game. We're not depriving them of those opportunities. Those are still there, but we want to make sure that the footprint is smaller as it occurs. So I asked Wade, I'm interrupting Scott's presentation, Scott, I hope you'll let me do this quick, because we talk about these investments and where they're going to occur. And I just want to make sure everybody realizes that. So we're going back to this map. We kind of breeze through this real quick, and this is a very important map. So as we talk about that mix of what occurs where, we're really talking about these lighter shaded areas within the community. Now, these footprints may flex and grow depending on the density and the exact scenario that we're talking about, but it'll be within a small degree of what you see here. In some cases, they might get a little bit bigger. In some cases, they might get a little bit smaller. But these are largely those areas that we're talking about as far as investment. This isn't finalized. As you can note, the giant draft stamp. We want your feedback on these. It's also important to remember that this is not your forever map. There's no such thing as a forever plan. And we've talked about it before. This is a flexible plan, but it's meant to breathe. It is meant to be looked at again in 5 years and to make sure it's working and forming the way it's supposed to for you guys. And then in 10 years, that's when this thing expires. We're looking out at 20 years to make sure that whatever we do for 10 years is going in the right direction for the 20-year plan, right? But your plan, your future land use plan should be updated every 10 years. So when we're talking about 10 years here to help us reach and achieve the vision and goals that we've heard from you and we've heard from the community. This is where and how we should be making investment and focusing our investment in ways that will help us best achieve that vision and those goals.
And let me tell you, that's another 2 or 3 hours of conversation to totally unpack that. So hopefully, you'll remember some of those prior conversations. If not, we're still here for questions and comments even after, this session is over. But so we're focusing in on these areas. So when we talk about these percentages, we're still focusing on these areas. And in some cases, it's largely a matter, I know density is a horrible word, but it's largely a matter of dialing that density up and down within those areas. In some cases, footprints might get a little bigger and smaller, but it's dialing that density up and down within those areas. So now we're going to get back to numbers.
And we have some graphics to show you what those footprints might look like. But first, we're going to talk about the scenarios and how that affects your residential growth. So we had our market analysts look at this table and then put it into some of the projections for the housing units that we talked about earlier. And here you can see what's new in this table is under the 5, the 10, and 20 year on the left. You can see the 4 scenarios that are added. The typical, that's what's happening today in the field, the balance, the community and clustered, and then the community concentrated. For each of those scenarios, running across, there's the first column there, you see for Tipton County, that is your totals, that is before the but-for. So that's something to note. Each of the communities, what potentially could be anticipated. Now, these numbers will flex again. It could be that there's one large planned development apartment complex that could make these numbers shift around quite a bit too. And then the total for the 5 municipalities there on the right is probably more important. And then what would occur elsewhere? What would occur outside those municipal boundaries from far right? So I'm going to talk mostly about the one on the bottom, the 20 year. So you see there at the top that you got the 5404 units that we talked about in the past. And kind of measuring those out across Covington, Mumford, Atoka, Brighton, Mason, and then the total for the municipalities based on each of those scenarios below that. So you can see specifically when you compare the typical at the top to the community concentrated at the bottom, you look at the numbers for those communities, see how small they are at the top, and then they go down. As they go down, they get much larger. So you're concentrating that development within those existing communities, and then on the opposite side, the elsewhere, those numbers start at the top because a lot of that development is occurring way out in your farmland and unincorporated areas, and then it shrinks as it goes to the bottom there as you're concentrating in your communities in those scenarios. So we want to get your feedback on some of that today. One thing to mention there at the top, those numbers are very important. The 25% out in the business as usual, that's what's occurring in your community. And the balanced growth pattern about 35%, adding in what's adjacent to that, closer to 50%. And then the community focus in the cluster in the countryside is 50% within those communities. And in the community concentration, you're reaching 75%. If you throw in what's next to that, you're approaching 80%. So next slide, Wayne. So these graphics are intended to illustrate what the footprint is side by side for each one of these scenarios. So the business as usual is in gray on your left, and the acreage footprint there is 24,712 acres. And I'll talk about what those numbers mean in those boxes as well. And then the balance pattern, how it shrinks some quite significantly down to 4,289 total acres in the community focus. In yellow, shrinks to 3,963 acres, and then the community concentration and countryside conservation is down under 3,000 at 2,758 total acres. Now, if you notice in the bottom left of your screen, those are where the development would occur. So the number 1 that you see in the box is related to what occurs within existing municipal boundaries.
So that's the number of acres within the existing municipal boundaries where new housing would occur. So we're not talking about the actual physical footprint of that house within those existing municipal boundaries.
And we're still looking at the market analysis too to determine what we believe those densities more or less are in those areas. So then the next one is 225 acres shown for that business as usual in or adjacent to, it's adjacent to those existing boundaries. In this particular scenario, we're not seeing a lot of growth in either 3 or 4, which is around the 4-way or the conservation cluster. Those are in other scenarios. And then finally, The business as usual is consuming a lot of land out in your countryside. So that's that FAR, the R1, the one dwelling unit per 12 acres or the one dwelling unit per 6 acres for the R1 that's currently occurring. And then you see how that changes. Those numbers begin to change. Those smaller boxes now have each number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in those in the other scenarios. And specifically, I'd like you to look at number 1 versus number 5. So number 5 is again what's happening outside your municipal boundaries in the countryside using the current R1 and FAR zoning district development pattern. So that footprint is much larger than the one which is occurring within your municipal boundaries. 157 in that second scenario, the bounce growth pattern, that changes to 225 acres as you incorporate more development in those communities. And then on the far right, it becomes the second largest at 337 acres compared to the largest there in the countryside at 2000.
Now, guys, we could keep just throwing numbers, and I'm sure y'all are a little numb with all these numbers we're throwing at you here verbally and on the screen, because I know I am. And you may not want to hear that from your planner, but it's true. These are a lot of numbers, and so I would really, this is just a lot, guys, and we realize this is like drinking from a fire hose in some cases. So we would invite you to continue to let these numbers sit with you for a little while. Read this. As you come up with questions, send them to us. We're going to stop talking here in a minute and actually make sure that you can ask some questions. And start providing feedback. We want to make sure that this is not us just telling you this stuff. We want to make sure that you understand what we're saying here. But the general theme of this is, you know, we're working with a lot of different variables that we've heard that we want to reduce the impact on some of our working countryside and natural features. So it's one of the things we're starting to achieve here. We also understand that we want to reinvest in our existing communities. In some cases, we have properties that are underutilized, let's say, if I'm being kind about it. We've heard that from you guys, working on the corridors and our gateways within our existing municipalities. Well, as we've noted before, every home built out on a farm, you know, on the countryside, that's one less rooftop and one less store that the market will be able to support in town. And so that's where some of these decision points start to occur and why we're showing these multiple scenarios. So I want everybody to keep that in mind as we look at this. There are some other things at play here on that reduction of the FAR footprint. I just want to note this. That's not entirely driven by, well, just less stuff is happening out there. Because of the market pressure coming to bear here, where somebody right now might, or in prior years, you know, a decade ago, might have been able to afford 12.5 acres of land. You and I both know, or all of you on the phone and I know that land prices have gone up pretty high here recently. It's increased substantially. And so that same person, their budget though hasn't necessarily increased. And so they may still want to build a home out in the countryside, but instead of 12.5 acres, they're probably now looking at, you know, well, maybe if they're lucky, right, 3 acres of land that they can afford. So you're going to see more homes on smaller tracts if we keep the FAR zoning in place as it is today. So it's something else to think about. That area within the countryside is going to reduce simply because of market pressure. However, it will not look rural. I think you guys know as well as I do, there are places in Tipton County, there are places, I can take you over to Marion, Arkansas, where the balkanization of farmland is occurring. And everybody thinks that 3 acres per home, well, that's like out in the country. Oh no, when you're on the ground, a home on 3 acre lots and a whole bunch of those, there's nothing rural about it. And so it's just something to keep in mind. It's one of many variables that's being incorporated into these numbers. But again, we'll stop talking here in a minute and open up questions. But we do have something else we want to show you as far as how these things. So these are just numbers and squares on the screen right now. Let's show you how these start to apply.
Yeah, now keep in mind, this is without the but for. So this is the original numbers from that table a few slides back. There you see the footprint of the business as usual in gray. That's 12% of your land there. 2.5% of buildable area in the blue. That's the balance area. About 2% for the community focus and clustered in the countryside. And then 1.5% of your buildable area in the community concentration and countryside conservation. So that's kind of the footprint of what could potentially occur.
But this is without the but for, so in a lot of ways, this is like fairy tale land.
Right.
Because this is not what's actually gonna happen. The Blue Oval is coming, and the related businesses and investment will have an additional impact. We'll have these secondary and continued impacts on the market and create future growth. So let's get to the next.
Yeah, the next slide.
More important.
This is the but for this. So this is the additional residential units. We don't have the breakdown yet from Howard on where some of those additional numbers occur within existing communities and so on. But taking those new numbers for housing units, the 7,362 units with the but for, now you can see how some of those footprints increase. So we went from like 24,000 total acres on the left in the business as usual, up to about 34,000 total acres with those additional residential units. And you see how some of those acreages change as well. And then your balance pattern, how it is now at almost 6,000 total acres. And in community focused, it's nearly 5.5 thousand acres. And then the buildable area for the community concentration conservation area, it is still the smallest, just like on the last one, but it is now 1.8% of your buildable area. 2.6 for the yellow, the community focused. And then the blue is the balanced growth pattern, 16% now for the business as usual. So you see how that's now increased from 12 to 16% for that business as usual.
But as important, Scott, that's a good point. As important, so you guys can see these numbers, you can read this. What we really want to talk about is how do these scenarios relate to the current land area that is Tipton County. Now, we know there are things there. We show this big green background and we'll update this. This is a draft to show, where there are municipalities. It's not just like it's a blank slate, the foreign land. Y'all know that as well as I do. So this is purely illustrative. We're showing here though, how these buildable areas relate to the county footprint. So when we say 16% within that scenario, so that's, and again, just like I said earlier, we're talking about 10 and 20 years. Well, that is a huge footprint within the county. That business as usual, that's the amount of land that scenario will consume in addition to what's already built out. So that's the footprint of the area, new area that will be consumed in that scenario. So I'm not saying, we're not here to tell you which one is the right answer, because you have to tell us based on your feedback and everything else. And we have already gotten feedback from you guys saying, like, why are we even looking at this? So I've got an idea of what you're going to think about this. But looking at this, it's noting that are we ready to basically allow or encourage or depict a land use scenario where 16, basically that footprint of land within the county is consumed in the next 10 or 20 years? I think I already know the answer to that without you guys telling me, but we're making sure you understand that there are always options. All the way over to our community concentration and countryside conservation. We want to show you that range. Now, that isn't the least smallest footprint we could show. We could increase the density, we could change factors in how we make these investments to reduce that footprint even more. But we're not doing that because, it begins to get a little extreme, you feel like. So these are what we feel based on what you have told us and based on the feedback we've received from the community. And to be honest, just what we see in the marketplace, both locally, regionally, and nationally, these are all reasonable scenarios that we see based on our experience. And based on your feedback, like I said. So this is part of that factor. This is part of that consideration that we think is important based on what we've heard from you guys is how much of the county that is not built out today should be developed in the future. That's part of our consideration. Do we need to stop? These are some huge problems.
A little bit of feedback. What we're going to talk about later, we can kind of put that off for comments later. This is pretty important to get feedback now on some of this and to understand where the questions might be on this. We do have some.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We had a request to chime in and yes.
feel free to chime in.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so listening to your numbers and looking at the graphs, especially on the residential growth, I noticed if you could go back a couple of graphs where it shows where y'all are basing everything on the R1, the information you had from the R1
Right.
and the FAR. So I know if you look at most of the developments that are in the municipalities now, especially in Mumford, Atoka area, most of the R1 developments are 10,000 square feet. You very rarely see the 30,000 square feet. So I think, are you guys using that bigger R1 number for your data? Because the reason why
This is all based on your building, on all of the building permit data that we received for all the communities and for the county. So this is not driven by our assumptions or just, our just kind of what we think. That is not an opinion driven thing. That is based on your building data on the permits for.
Most of the municipalities now, are let's just say anywhere there's current sewer infrastructure. Let's say that, especially in the south end municipalities, we're already seeing some R4, R1 is predominantly everything. And I know minimum in some of the municipalities are 10,000 square feet. I think Covington's 13,000 square feet for minimum. I could be wrong on that. But I know, we're going to probably see some R4s and some mixed use data on that. So there are some requests on that for development, especially future wise. So I see it, and I'm looking at the screen you have up now. Looking at that, and the reason why I'm questioning it is because I'm just looking at Atoka, and that's primarily where I know kind of what's going on. But just looking at this data here, there's not enough land use for that many homes, in the future there. So I just want to make sure that we're going to have the right data, because I'm questioning the whole 30,000 square foot on the R1.
Okay. Clarify that 30,000 square foot was really measured in those areas that are not incorporated or not in the growth areas. These are beyond that. This is that yellow and the green. And what we were looking at for those municipalities, the density was going to be much higher. So instead of the 1 per acre or 1 per 30,000 square feet, those densities might be, let's say in your municipalities, as high as 8 units per acre.
But that's for our future numbers. But what is also informing this, though, is building permit data, are the permits that have been pulled, and what we know is changing in the market. So you mentioned like how things are changing in the market. That does start to take this into consideration. In saying that we know, and like I was saying earlier, where somebody could afford 12.5 acres before, now they can only afford 3 or less based just on land values. That's part of what's driving this in these scenarios, is knowing that land value simply will not permit the low density that we've been seeing. It won't permit that. We can't, our incomes are not going up fast enough. Not everybody's going to be a millionaire on 12.5 acres. Because that's what would happen. Either everybody's income has to go through the roof, or the land parcels have to get smaller.
Right, that's very true, because we're already seeing, like in our county, generally you can survey you off a 5-acre section, and build on it, without going through, planning and and all that with subdivision regulation. So I would say 5 acres is probably like the biggest in the area, and most of those 5-acre tracts, in the last 3 years have more than doubled in cost. So you're correct on that, and that's my point. My point is, I think you know, as some of the developers and some people come through here, you know, and you know, there, like y'all talked about, there's not all the farms aren't going to be for sale. I mean, you know, there's a lot of land that's either not going to be for sale or you can't develop it. So if we get these small pods of subdivision developments, then, you know, more than likely they're gonna have a lot of density to them. You know, they're gonna either be an R4 or an R1 or mixed in there. You know, so I know that's kind of what I'm seeing. I mean, you know, I'm in the building business. I'm in the residential building business, so that's kind of what, you know, what I'm hearing and the developers and things like that that are trying to look at do stuff. That's what they're looking at also. So.
Yeah, and you know, there's a degree, depending on the way, the shape and the form of that occurring, we might actually, in our scenarios, we're basically talking about juicing that a little bit. In some of these scenarios of saying, yeah, we understand that, you know, Farmer Smith may be looking to sell his land, or he's at a break-even point. He's teetering. He doesn't necessarily want to sell, but he's not looking at this as a multi-generational thing. So can we create a situation where financially he can benefit from investment in a way, though, that essentially saves the farm, more or less, where, hey, you're going to be able to develop a section of your farm, you know, of your 500 acres. You'll be able to develop we want you to be able to develop a section of that in a way where we still have 400 or 450 working acres of farm, but you still get the same value that you would have if you developed the entire thing at this much lower density. So let's cluster all of those homes in one area, and it makes that surrounding working farmland, it just makes it easier for it to stay working farmland. And it also starts to reduce our impact on some of our utilities and our infrastructure. It starts talking, and we won't get into that today, but it does have an impact. You know, 100 homes over 100 acres create different loads on our roadway system than 100 homes over, you know, let's say over 20 acres.
That's right. I have one more question to ask, and I'm gonna go back to muting myself. But when you go on your map where it shows where you are, where the green and the light gray, where it shows where y'all see the.
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because I was hoping people would talk about that. We're gonna pull it up real quick.
Okay. So all right. So looking at that. So looking at that map there, you know, my question for you guys would be, is why, you know, what would be the reasoning? And there's a couple of major intersections on the east side of the county I'm thinking about, especially on that Highway 14 area there. You know, why wouldn't you earmark some of those for future growth? I know you did down there in that.
That is an excellent question. That is a great. I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah,
that is a great question, and it is one that I was hoping that you guys would ask. And you know, it comes back to where we were talking about, you know, choices. One, it's two things I'd like to go in on with that. Is one, choices. We don't have the blank checkbook of growth. And then two is to talk about that. Again, this is looking at 10 years and then setting us up for 20. So one of the things we've heard, of course, is we want to invest in the existing communities that we basically, I'll be honest with you, you know, we feel like, you know, Covington is in town. We look at, you know, I'm not going to get into Atoka and Munford at this point because they have their own comprehensive plans that have been recently updated, but we look at Brighton. I think we can all acknowledge looking at Mason. And I was just there at the BMA meeting the other night, the 3.5 hour long BMA meeting, and got to experience that. But, you know, you're in our existing communities, and you know what? There are simply a lot of big vacant parcels of land within our existing communities that have sewer, that have water, that have power, that are, you know, have roads servicing them, things like that. It's so much land within our existing municipalities. I know we don't necessarily see, sometimes it's behind a business. Sometimes, you know, it's 100 yards down a road off the main road, but we all know where those pieces of land are. We have working farms, in other words, within a mile or in some cases less of our county courthouse.
That's right.
And
That's right.
so, and already have utilities and services. And so what we're saying is, this isn't the forever plan, but we're saying, hey, guys, we've got this investment going, but we have so much land already available where we already have all of these utilities and we already have our schools with capacity and we already have parks and we already have a police force and a fire station and everything else. Why would we start duplicating those services? I'm not saying it constricts everything with those areas, but why would we wholesale start looking at duplicating services away from where we're already providing services before we start reinvesting in our existing communities, specifically when we hear, and kind of this underlying tone from everybody is saying, hey, do you remember when the square was more vibrant? It's vibrant. Everybody loves the square. It's vibrant. But remember when it was even more vibrant and active? Remember when there weren't so many vacancies on Highway 51 in town? Remember when Mason's downtown wasn't vacant? Remember when Brighton was more of a center, it was more of an active happening place? Well, we want to see that again. We've heard clearly from folks that they want to see that again. And so what we're saying is, hey, guys, for the first 5-10 years worth of growth, why not focus it? Because we're hearing this from y'all and from the residents. Why not focus that within our communities to rebuild some of that vibrancy, to rebuild that activity? And then after we've done that, because guys, that's what I want to see, that's what y'all want to see, but that's also what we know the market in general is clamoring for in a post-pandemic world. Are these really active, vibrant social places? And so why don't we rebuild our communities and strengthen them? And then after 5 years, after 10 years, that's when you start saying, okay, the next lowest hanging fruit is out these corridors, right? Is, at these new intersections and everything. And that we shouldn't get into, well, development is just going to happen there. It only happens there if you guys say it should happen there. But what we're hearing is that no, investment should happen here first. And then we can start talking about investment happening where we have to extend a sewer line, where we have to build a new fire station, where we also have to build a school and parks and everything else.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, it does, yes, and I firmly believe Covington, the whole Covington area, is going to see more of that than the other municipalities down south and Mason. I think those two are going to see the more of let's turn what we got into something else, better, a better community than new, so.
Yeah, and I'll say, Mason,
and
I don't think Mason would deny this. Mason has some challenges, let's say, that have to be overcome in order for significant investment to occur there. Right.
But I think Covington, there's a lot of value in Covington there with some stuff, and I think that that area is going to see a whole lot more than probably than what the Mumford and Atoka area is. So, but I appreciate you guys answering my questions. Thank you.
They were great questions, and they were ones that I'm glad you asked, because if you hadn't, we'd have had to kind of work I would have had to ask that false question to Scott. Hey, Scott, what do you think? So I'm really glad you asked it. It's a very smart and very pertinent question. And so, guys, keep them coming. Are there other questions and comments like that? Because that was a really good question.
That the one thing when it makes sense and understand what you're saying, I think what's throwing me off anyway, and I think some other people, is along the Highway 14 corridor, why you expect the growth to be at that intersection of Mount Carmel or 384 and 14 instead of at 59 and 14, because for us, there's already like a gas station at that 59 and 14. There's already some stuff there where you've got the growth at Mount Carmel. There's a church.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Robin. And I'll tell you, and again, guys, there's and Robin, everybody, there's a reason there's the giant draft stamps on this. Actually, that's the way originally it was across the entire county, but it kind of was a little difficult to read, so we moved them off a little bit. But this is not saying that these areas can't change and change dramatically. And so one of the reasons, Robin, is that it's the sewer system, because we have a pumping station and a forced main over to the school.
Yeah.
Or over to that area, and we have a school there. And so it was that combination. So, we looked at that earlier map, the first draft of all of this, where we layered up all that stuff. It was the fact that we have road capacity overlapped with the school and the capacity there. And because we know we have the sewer line that kind of ties into there. And so it's like, that sewer line, to be honest, and its location here on the highway and the capacity of the road at this point was the differentiator between, do we put it here or up at 59 and 14?
Okay, sorry, I didn't think about the school. But yeah, that makes very good sense.
But it's a good highlight, Robin, to say that in and of itself doesn't elevate that up so much to where we can't say, maybe it should go up at 59 and 14 because we do already have the community sees that more as a service area because of the gas station. And so it might mean that it does shift up to that intersection. What I would say is that we probably wouldn't, though, be looking at doing both. We would probably want to choose one or the other for that investment.
Yeah, one thing that we didn't get into much was talking about potential reserves for future generations. We kind of played around, toyed with some of those ideas, specifically at that intersection that was mentioned at 59 and 14. That development may occur there, but it may not occur for 20 years, or at least until we hit that 7,000 mark.
It's kind of like what we're saying. It goes back to that original comment saying that, and we're going to show those eventually. It's kind of like I want to get over this hump right now. This is the more critical information and decision making. Is to say that, if we do this, where we're doing this, it does need to lead into that future growth, but let's make sure that our communities, if we make this investment, encourage this investment to occur in areas in a smart way, Tipton County could become the premier destination the premier place to live, work, and play in West Tennessee. Because you've already got such a good foundation, let's keep building on the foundation you've built. And so, we'll eventually get to that future footprint, as you were. Okay, so this is great information. Not sure, and guys, I'm not sure if you can see this, got it in the chat box here, not sure that the sewer line and school can have connections, that we need to check on that. And yes, absolutely, because that could be the make or break moment for whether we're talking about development occurring there or up here. So we got to confirm that. Absolutely.
Anyone else have a comment?
Please keep them coming, guys. This is good. This is great. I know again, guys, and I'll shut up. Please interrupt me if you got a comment or question. But go ahead.
I will ask another question. In the very beginning of your presentation in this meeting, you guys were throwing the scenario numbers out about, where we were going to be growth wise and things like that, how much commercial, how much square footage. Are you guys basing that on like Haywood and Fayette and them getting the same amount as we are, or how are you guys coming up with those numbers there?
This is based on, so it's multiple things. It's based on the market analysis. And that market analysis is not driven by, it is, we recognize Haywood County as a place and things are happening there, but we recognize that Tipton is unique. And so this is the growth that's coming to Tipton County because Tipton County wants it. We go way back to one of the conversations of, just because a community can grow doesn't mean it will grow. It has to want to grow and develop. Collierville is being a good example of doing everything in their, I shouldn't say this, I'm gonna get in trouble one of these days, but I feel the perception is maybe that Collierville is doing a lot to try to not encourage growth, or very specific kinds of growth. And so that's one of the reasons the survey and the questions, those interviews are so important, was to understand that factor. And so, no, this is driven by you guys. And as you'll know, like, for example, in the industrial market analysis, we do look at the region though. We are looking at Haywood and what's happening over there. We are looking at Shelby and Fayette. We are looking at Jackson and Madison to understand what's happening there. And that's part of this overall analysis. Because, for example, under the industrial, we say, well, there's 6 million square feet kind of in the immediate future that could be captured outside of Haywood. So we do look at it. It does inform it. I realize that may be a little vague. You're not in a vacuum, but you are creating your own path and destiny here. Based on the survey, plus the market analysis, plus the interviews questions, based on that feedback, it could have potentially, I would imagine, been a lot higher, but it could have also been a lot lower. It was it's tailored to what we know the county wants and the communities want. We also factor in some other things too there. There's also because I've talked to Howard about this, and this is maybe one of the more driving points. And it's interesting because I know we have contractors and builders and developers on the line as well as part of our team here. The committee is that there's the market demand. There's our willingness and, to accept or even encourage development in our communities. But I think the contractors, hey, I'm talking to you guys, hopefully they'll back me up on this. There's also just the sheer ability to grow. We all know that labor is tight right now. And that's one of the things that are part of this is saying, just because you can grow doesn't mean that you get that lot platted and that you even have an available work crew that can show up there and build a house the next day. We have a constraint in our region. It's not as severe in Tipton as it is in Haywood, for example. Haywood is pretty severe of just the ability to grow, that we don't have the bodies and the infrastructure necessary on the ground in Haywood County, for example, to simply build houses wherever we want to at the scale we want to build them. Well, Tipton has some of those constraints as well. They're not as severe as Haywood, but they are there. You can't simply go out and build 1,000 homes tomorrow. It's just not possible. It would take time, institutional time and infrastructure time, and just to assemble process approvals, and then just to get the bodies there on the ground to, start pouring the concrete. And so it takes, I'm sorry, it was a really long answer. And hopefully I didn't go off the rails too much, but it is a complicated, but in-depth detail number. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be asking questions and questioning that. And if you guys see stuff that you're like, Jonathan, this just doesn't make sense, or I don't believe it. That's about as deep as I can go into these. And that is a good reason for us to get Howard back on the line. That is part of why he's here, is to help address those and to make sure we get them right. I never discount gut instinct. Gut instinct is a very powerful tool. Does that help, or did I just totally drown everybody out in thought there? Oh, I might have killed him.
I think hopefully they understood. Anyone else have a comment before we move into the growth principles? All right. Well, you received the growth principles in draft form from Robin on Monday. So we'll go through these. The vision was already set, but growth principle number one, this is going to be your homework more or less also, is to look at these, to study how to see if there's something that we left out. So these are the principles for growth over the next 20 or 30 years, whatever it might be, for growth that occurs. So first, and this is a quote, protect our story. That was something that was brought up at one of our stakeholder meetings. And to accommodate growth while ensuring the type and scale of investment does not erode or degrade the county's rural character, historic assets, rolling river bluffs, picturesque landscapes, productive farmland, natural waterways, and environmental sensitive areas. So protecting what you have. Next slide. And sort of related to that is to preserve and enhance certain things. And that could be related to maybe let's say Covington Square that you see on the image below, or some of the rural character and scenery. So preserve and enhance the rural character, agricultural lands, natural environment, special events, it's also very important, brought up over and over. And Covington Square, which is cherished by the community for future generations. Next slide. Number 3 is reinforce existing spaces. So focus, and this gets into focusing that development, what we heard from the community, into in around your existing communities, thereby strengthening each community while concentrating services where convenient to the growing population. So you may have some clustering of development, sort of like what you see there on the left, some small area plans that may help guide some of that growth. Let's say near Covington Square down towards the farmland on the east side of town.
And another example that's coming out, well, we were talking, because it's interesting, we were talking about the school down there off 14 and growth there related to somewhere else. That's a great example of that. And the way it starts to inform both private and public investment, we might even say, like, based on this, and this is how these things are getting applied, say, hey, well, we need a new fire station, or we're looking at building a new park, or there's a new service center for the county. We start looking at those places where we may already have an asset on the ground, and we reinforce it by building another asset nearby. And then you start really creating a community around those assets.
That's right. So a lot of the cases, those are anchored around those assets or park spaces. Next slide. Your corridors and gateways were very important. We heard that at the stakeholder meetings, at the public session as well, improving how they look and strengthening those. So encourage improvement, revitalization, and beautification of corridors and gateways, including the maintenance and reuse of existing structures. It's very important to fill those vacant buildings or redevelop those. Also, improved connectivity. There's a lot of concern about traffic and some of the side effects from growth. So improved connectivity within and between existing communities. And that could be including a network of options for walking, biking, transit, while retaining and expanding natural corridors for recreation and wildlife. So not just for people, but for the wildlife as well. Next slide. Number 6 is accessible facilities, placing those facilities where the community can make the most of those and scattering those around between the communities as well. So locate public facilities, community centers, parks and recreation, neighborhood shopping, local restaurants, and other amenities in existing communities to be convenient to and where possible, walkable to area residents. So we heard things like park spaces, local restaurants, just neighborhood assets in other community facilities, even in some cases schools, where they may need to be within like a 10 to 15 minute walk, or at least not necessarily there, but convenient to those residents in the area, or it'd be a short drive instead. Then number 7 is quality and inclusive, promote high quality, inclusive, inviting places that enhance small town charm, nurture personal growth, elevate education, which you have right now that's very strong, support small business, and provide opportunities for existing residents and new arrivals to mingle, socialize, foster relationships that generate a stronger sense of community. Community was raised over and over that you did not want to lose your identity, that instead of new arrivals changing you, that you wanted to bring them in, welcome them to the community, and hold your existing character, your small town charm. Next slide. Maintaining attainability. So this would be promoting development of a wide variety of housing types, price ranges, development forms, basically giving you a wide range of housing types to keep it more affordable. So broaden that attainable building for people of all lifestyles, ages, and economic resources, whether that's a new family that's just moving into the area that may work in one of the factories, or somebody who's retiring as well. Lower income, higher income. And finally, fiscal responsibility, building on what you already have there with a strong fiscal balancing budgets, and making and choosing a strong asset or investments that are well formed by the community. You have some photographs there, keeping the community involved, making those choices based on what the priority should be for your community. Not necessarily holding a balanced budget, but when you do go out and do investments for bonds and so on, making a wise choice directing those funds where they need to be and maybe where they might generate more revenue down the road. Next slide. So we're beginning to mock up the report itself. We're playing around with different formats. This is just a couple pages of what it might be. This particular mock-up shows a 8.5 by 11 side-by-side, maybe pages 2 and 3 or something. It might show acknowledgements, the table of contents that we talked about a little bit last time around. So we're going to continue to develop this over the next month or so and hopefully get to about a 30 to 50% draft. So most of what we've already done would be incorporated into that early draft. It would be mocked up page by page. There would be some blank pages for the actual growth scenarios, the fiscal analysis that will come out of that, and then the preferred scenario in the land use plan itself, and designating those land uses throughout your county. So this is just one thing that we're playing with. We'll show you a lot more in the coming months on this as well, and get into the review of that. But your homework for the next meeting, excuse me, would be to review those growth principles. Preferably send those by July 7th, but we'll keep that open probably about a week longer. And let us know, we're probably missing something in those 9 growth principles. There may be something that we need to tweak in one of the existing ones. We may have left something out completely that should be the 10th one as well. So please try to send those in, review those. Also the maps and everything else that's in this presentation. We'll put this online probably in the next day or so, this presentation along with the recording itself. And then that draft report, which would come probably at your next meeting, somewhere in the 30 to 50% range. And then the fiscal analysis results. We're hoping to have some early results by the next meeting. We're not sure exactly when, but we will send Robin an update as we go through it. He's conducting different interviews right now and building his model that will then test each of those scenarios. So then we can air it out to the public in a public format, first with the steering committee, and then probably another open house as well. So move on to the next slide, Wade. So right now we are projecting that the next meeting would occur August 16th. And probably that would be a Zoom meeting. We're hoping to have some of those fiscal analysis numbers. It could potentially become an in-person meeting. That is if we can get the market analysts and the fiscal analysts there and to go over those if they're ready to vet with the community. And at that meeting, we'd also probably look to set that open house if we have those results at that time. So we'll have more visuals. We'll have the financial numbers related to each of those scenarios to unveil hopefully at the next meeting. And please send your comments to me or send them to Robin. She can get them to me. Go back and look at those maps in the presentation. There's a lot we went over today. There's probably going to be quite a bit more questions. What you will probably see in the future is a map related to each development scenario that, like Jonathan mentioned, that will flex, that those areas within the communities might shrink some where there's more development outside and also expand in the others as well. So we're hoping to show you those at the August 16th meeting. If you have any comments, send those to us, and I will wrap up my presentation at this time and just open it up for a comment or two here at the end. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We'll be looking for your comments and emails over the next couple of meetings. I appreciate. We'll get this information to Sean Anderson. He will get this posted probably, let's say, by lunchtime tomorrow, maybe, to give him a little extra time too. And we'll have to wrap up and maybe trim this as well a little bit. But we appreciate your participation, and please let the others know that missed this because of the communications issue up there. Know that this will be online as well. Thank you so much.